this week, that's what we're talking about, is this massive wave of changes that came over European culture during from the 1400s to the 1600s, because it changes everything about what they do. And as a result, all the interactions with other countries change. So that's what we're going to focus on this week. So let's talk about the collision of empires that happens in the Crusade. Now, we brought this up a couple of times when we were talking about the Islamic Golden Age. We were talking about the fact that because the Islamic countries were on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, they were closer to where a lot of that philosophy was written and archived. The philosophy of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, the math and the science of Copernicus and Ptolemy were all cataloged and kept. Whereas for the Western Mediterranean cultures, they were stepping back away from the Mediterranean into like wilderness areas that didn't have all of that stuff. And they were backing further and further away from that seat of civilization where all those, you know, Greek and Roman Empire kind of philosophies and advances happened. So the kingdom of the Franks, the kingdom of the English, the kingdom of the barbarians in Germany, all of the Holy Roman Empire is all taking a step back away from all of that cultural learning that took place BC. But in the Islamic side, you know, where the Islamic Empire is spreading, they're holding on to it. So they're building libraries, they're building madrasas that have massive archives of all of those work, and they are teaching it and expounding on it. And we talked about that quite a bit when we were talking about the Islamic Golden Age. When the Crusades happen, that stuff filters back into Europe again. So the Crusaders go into the Islamic held territories, and a lot of what they bring back with them is stuff from that ancient past, is stuff from antiquity, Greek and Roman works that haven't been looked at by the Europeans in several generations are suddenly translated into Arab, which makes it possible to translate them back into English or back into French or back into one of those European languages, and they filter into society again as a result of the Crusades. That's not the only thing that filters into society as a result of the Crusades. The other thing that filters into society as a result of the Crusades is the plague. They bring with them all of the illnesses that the Islamic empires have been trading back and forth on the Silk Road and have been building up immunities to. They bring those back into Europe. And as a result of the Crusades, there is this massive increase of various illnesses, the most profound of which, of course, is the Black Death. That interaction between the Far East and the Europe made it possible to transmit this disease super fast. And of course, we know that people, you know, came back with it into urban centers, and the urban centers began to get sick, and in a panic, people left the urban centers and fled to the countryside and took it with them when they went. And as a result, it spread over the whole countryside, the entire landscape of Europe, like really, really, really fast. So some of the results of the Crusade, both because of the interaction of new old material, because they were bringing back ancient material, and because of the Black Plague, resulted in a sort of a sea change of ideology across Europe. One of them was that they started to distrust the church. And did we talk about that in this class a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit, the fact that we had bishops who were
hiding
in their castles instead of dealing with the sick, that we had priests who were dying while trying to fulfill the last rites, and that as a result, the last rites were not getting done, and people were basically deciding that all of that stuff that the church has been saying all along about the power of the priests to determine your salvation might not be 100% true. It seems like if they had any power at all, they'd be able to end the plague, first of all. And as a result of increased one wave after another, after another, after another of knights going off to the Crusades and coming back, basically not victorious. Remember, the overarching goal of the Crusades was to retake Jerusalem. And the closest they got was in the First Crusade, arguably the second, not the fifth, definitely not the sixth. They got further, the more they crusaded against the Arabs in Jerusalem, the more locked in Jerusalem got into the Ottoman Empire. So, you know, crusade weariness, and they taxed to support these crusades. So peasantry had to work harder. Every time a knight went away and then died, his whole estate fell into disarray, and everybody had to try to figure out where they belonged, and lands were seized by the church, and the church ate up a lot of money, and it just became this situation where they were just weary of it. And as a result of those new writings coming in, suddenly there was a rise in humanism. Now, humanism, that's an important word. Humanism is the belief that the human life now is more important than the afterlife later. That the source of divinity is in the human, not necessarily in, the divine. It's the belief that it's more important to focus on yourself and your own self-improvement and how you as a person can affect the world you're living in now than it is to invest in your eternal soul and believe in the, purpose of society as a reflection of heaven or any of that kind of stuff. Let's focus on the now. That's humanism in a nutshell. So suddenly there is this rippling wave of humanism that is coming into Europe. And it has a lot of different effects, but part of the reason for that is because of new sciences that are coming in, one of which is philology, okay? Philology is the study of languages. It's the history of the structure of written language. As a result of a rise in interest in how languages work, people began retranslating the Bible using new information. Have you all experienced that in your own lifetime, that people are like looking back at the Bible and going, this word that we thought means this actually means this, and it changes everything that you were brought up to believe? If that's true, then it changes an awful lot. Then that seems an important thing that they should have worked out early. Well, as a result of that, it begins to call into question the scriptures that have been taught. If one word can mean one thing and a translation has it meaning another thing, can we trust anything that's in the scriptures? Can we trust any of what they have to say? It's dangerous territory. But people begin to pull it apart and ask those questions because of these new sciences that are coming in. And it's not just the Roman translation of the New Testament. It's also retranslating all of those ancient philosophers. But the biggest profound one is, of course, that they retranslate the New Testament. And when they do, it's different. Things you've been taught your whole life are different in this new translation. So no trust for the church as a result of that. Like, trust for the church goes down, plummets, some would say. There are new political ideologies that are based in that humanism, like it's okay to commit, selfish acts if it advances you and your family, because Machiavelli is probably the most famous example of this. He wrote The Prince, and his philosophy, for lack of a better word, his instructions were to do what you needed to do to advance your family, because a good, powerful family being in charge of a society makes the society stable. So here's how a family becomes powerful, and this is how you can do it. And this is why it's okay, because at the end of that, while you may have been a scheming, manipulative bitch, and I'm talking to you, Mrs. Medici, while you yourself may have been scheming and manipulative, the society underneath you benefits from that stability. So it's okay. So he didn't invent, it's like it says, he didn't invent scheming families. He just made them feel okay about what they were doing. This happens again in history, by the way. This happened in the late 80s in the economy, where suddenly it was okay to shortchange the lowest ranking member of your corporation if it meant that the overall bottom dollar was healthier. So
that's where the end justifies the means.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if the ends justify the means, if your corporation gets healthier, then it's okay that your lowest ranking employees don't make enough to live off of, because the important thing is that you have that bigger profit margin, which makes you a healthier corporation.
Okay, then again, last week when the GameStop.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Wall Street bets, man.
Yeah. If you start telling the people at the top of the chain that the ends justify the means, then the bottom of the chain is going to get the message eventually. So we'll see. Opposing factions are an opportunity, not a problem. So it's okay to pit yourself against another big family. And it's during this time that we start to really see the rise of the Habsburgs and the Medicis and the Borgias, these big merchant families that are marrying into royalty and then, you know, amassing power as a result of this very humanistic idea. One of the things that this brings us into, we call this era the Renaissance, okay? The Renaissance, if you want to be like a snob about it. The Renaissance, which is like a reinvention of a lot of different things, and it affects a lot of different areas. But when you look at those areas, you realize that those affect other things too. So let's take a look at some of the changes that are made as a result of this influx of new technologies and old ideas into the middle of Europe. We have new art forms. We have all of these guys are Renaissance painters. So you've probably heard of most of them. Most of them are Ninja Turtles, I think. Raphael, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Donatello, and then also some others that aren't Ninja Turtles, obviously. Botticelli, for example. Some of the new things that they bring in are, for example, oil paint. I don't know what paint was made of before it was brought in, but the introduction of oil into those substances made it possible to make paintings look three-dimensional. If you look at pre-Renaissance paintings, they don't look three-dimensional. But the idea of making things darker and lighter so there's a foreground and a background so that things can stand out against other things that are behind them, that's a Renaissance idea that was actually brought over using technology that was being used in those Eastern Mediterranean Islamic empires. And as a result, you have more 3D of more of brighter colors and darker shadows and a 3D effect as a result of that introduction of new technologies into art. It's kind of cool. The idea of geometry affecting where your eye looks in a painting is brought in from, that's a very Islamic idea. I guess the Byzantines use it a little bit, but it's a very Eastern Mediterranean idea that you can direct the point of view of a viewer onto a piece of art using geometry, using placement. And this seems like, okay, this is great for art history, but actually it also affects how armies are laid out, how cities are laid out. As a result of this Renaissance idea, the idea that you can direct market traffic by using visual cues so that people know which way to go actually affects the layouts of cities during this time.
Paint
Like,
was made out of egg yolk.
say again?
Paint was made out of egg yolk.
Egg yolk.
Right, which makes it, I mean, it's harder to get, it's a wash, right? So it's harder to get the darker colors, so it's harder to make the shadows that you can paint light colors on top of. Like it turns into kind of a wash.
Well, when I was in my corrections officer area,
Uh-huh.
the inmates would use Kool-Aid to make their face up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And you go down through there, and he's dressed up as a she, and you have to write him up for contraband because Kool-Aid is made for drinking,
Okay.
not make it up the face.
So what
and,
I
you know.
just got from this was we should not mess with you.
I'm so old right now, I can't do all that stuff I used to do.
But you know things. That's it. That's the important
You
thing.
have connection.
Right. Okay. So that's a good example of this, because if you walk into a correctional facility, how do the prisoners know which way to go?
Lies.
Right. Geometry. They follow a visual cue
Yeah.
to go where they need to go. So this is something that happens with. This is something that happens in art, and you can see it like this is the Last Supper, which is a very famous painting. Obviously, Jesus is dead center in this portrait, but all of the lines in the picture go towards Jesus in this picture. And in this point, they just go to the center here, even though the most important things are happening on the sides. What is actually you're drawn to attention to is these two disciples that are walking side by side. So, there is an influx of Hellenistic influence on all of this art forms. Hellenistic, that means from the time of the Greek and Roman Empire, when everything was being traded all around the Mediterranean and it was just a big highway, there were certain things that were common forms of beauty, common ideals of beauty that you see in statues all across the Mediterranean, but that after it turned into a border, kind of filtered out of society in Europe. Now they're suddenly coming back. Now, if you want to know what a biblical character looks like, he looks an awful lot like a Greek hero from the same era. So new artists are using a very old idea of what a hero looks like. And this picture, obviously, this is David, Michelangelo's David, and I'm only showing you the top half of it because, anyway. But the idea of David resembling, even though David himself would have been a bearded tribesman, even at his young age, he would have started, having facial hair, looking instead like Apollo, draws a connection between the ancient Greek hero and the ancient biblical hero that you can't ignore, Plus also David, even though he was a little guy, is humongous in this statue for some reason. But probably the biggest place that you see it in the new art forms is not just that they're three-dimensional or that they are using, ancient Greek-looking heroes in everything that they do, but also that hidden amongst these new art forms is a nod to the humanistic idea. So those of you who haven't taken this class before, shut up. What do you see in this picture?
God and
Wait, I know this one.
I know, shut up.
and that's God, he's touching the model.
Right, this is God, and he's touching Adam, and this giving Adam the spark of life and bringing Adam to life. This is a very biblical story. This is painted by anybody?
Michelangelo.
Right, okay, so is it Michelangelo? Yeah, it's Michelangelo. So Michelangelo, who was himself a humanist, and therefore had no interest himself personally, but was always being contacted and contracted to do these biblical works. I mean, this is in the top of the Sistine Chapel, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a big, holy place, and he's been contracted to do this work, even though he himself is a humanist. How can you tell that he's a humanist from this picture? That's right. This is the shape of a human brain. And until somebody points that out to you, you might not have noticed it.
Especially to like somebody in that era that would never like.
Yeah, look at it. It's a robe. It's circling around him. It's no big deal, But it's actually God in the human brain. So you suddenly start to see these little hints of very humanistic ideas filtering even into the most sacred art that's being contracted at the time. For example, the top of the Sistine Chapel.
Is there a rumor that him and the priest that paid him got into a fight and that's why his dick's all over the top of the church?
I've never heard that rumor.
Whether that's true or not, that's my rumor.
I've never heard that rumor, but I will say that Michelangelo does put a lot of that stuff, and a lot of Renaissance artists did put a lot of phallic symbology in their work.
Drunk history?
Yeah, that sounds like a drunk history thing, Jordan. Might still be true. Just because it's drunk history doesn't mean it's not true. So humanism actually filtering into the art spaces, that's like a big thing that happens during this time. There's new architecture that comes in, and it's coming from that Eastern Mediterranean influence, the shapes of domes instead of just pinnacles and towers. If you look at Welsh castles, a lot of them are pinnacles and towers, and the idea of bringing in things from Eastern Europe and Eastern Mediterranean and making them a part of cathedrals in England and in France. One of the things that you see a lot of are domes, and heavily influenced by that interaction between them.
Now, my question is, did he paint it before the dome went up, or did he paint it after the dome?
The Sistine Chapel? Yeah, he painted it after it was built. He was up on a scaffold, laying down on his back painting. There are suppositions that that's what he did anyway. I don't think he could float. So more ancient stories of Rome and Greece managed to make it in. So we have a whole new group of rewriting, adaptations of those old plays and those old things suddenly in the middle of the 1400s and 1500s. Biblical stories come out and they resemble those ancient Greek stories, like plays about David and Goliath, in which David is played by somebody that's supposed to be very much like Apollo. Things like that happen. And the music that comes in is now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea that there was no music in the churches before this, but the idea of making music a part of the worship service is new to the Renaissance era. They start to contract with composers to write things that will be holy, and those composers don't have to be that holy themselves. Kind of like the artists, they're allowed to bring in whatever musical form they're already using, but they should be singing about biblical things. And once they've done that, then that becomes a part of the church service. So you end up with choirs singing madrigals that are about the Holy Virgin Mother and things like that. And that becomes really easily slides right into songs that worship the kings too, you know. So there aren't a whole lot of examples of Hellenistic music because you can't archive music, and they didn't write their music, they just performed it and then taught those performances. So we don't actually know what ancient Greek music sounded like. But if you take the music of the Eastern Mediterranean at this time, and then you ladle on top of it the biblical Christian, you know, stories, then you end up with Renaissance music. So we know that it was heavily influenced by those Arab countries. And there's a relationship between the words and the music that didn't exist before. You can see the difference in the Renaissance versus the Baroque. So the Baroque art is crowded. It's crowded. It's super crowded. Like every space that can be used is used, and every square inch of space that can be used is used. You can always tell. And Renaissance kept things more Greco-Roman and also kind of simpler. But that's getting into art history, and we're tripping over something I don't know as much about as I would like. Another really big influence of this crossover, the collision of cultures, is the new sciences it brought in. Now, the Islamic Golden Age, remember, they never stopped doing this science. They took the sciences of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Indians and the ancient Middle Eastern cultures, and they pulled them together, and then they expanded on them. So they've been making scientific advancements all along. They've been investing in their science all along. But suddenly now these sciences are available to Europeans. So the Europeans are taking what they learn in the Crusades and they're bringing it back, and they're starting to translate those documents that have been translated from Greek to Arab, and now they're translating back into English. And scientists are actually starting to use them. How do you think that's going to go?
It's going to be rough for the church.
You think so?
Yeah.
Well, the overarching message was, we don't want any of that new stinking science. What's the matter with you? We know exactly where the sun is. But the same wave of influences that's changing the art forms and changing the music and changing the literature can't be kept out of changing the sciences. The same people are having conversations about both. The same people who are saying, I'm not sure about the way that the scripture was actually written, if it means what we think it means, are also saying, also, maybe the whole universe doesn't revolve around the earth. Maybe there's something to this idea of the sun being bigger than we think it is. You know, and they're getting flack for it. So Nicholas Copernicus, who is in German Poland, reread a translation of what Ptolemy had written back in ancient Greece. And Ptolemy's writing had been translated into Arab and then translated back into one of the languages that he could read. So, and he reread it and he studied it. And as a result, he recalculated the landmass and the size of the globe based both on Ptolemy and the fact that Columbus had found this whole continent that should not fit on the earth. Remember, the issue was not that people believed the earth was flat. It was that they thought the earth was small. They thought the earth was much smaller than it actually was. So when he uses what Ptolemy had to say, which was wrong, arguably, this is the view of the universe according to a earth-centric idea. Even then, they knew it was a globe. They just thought it was a spinning globe and that the universe spun around it. But and he recalculated it using that, with the sun at the center, casting a shadow on the moon, which then gave him a mathematical equation that recalculated the size of the whole world. So Galileo Galilei also reread Euclid, which was mathematical, and he took his what he saw as evidence from Ptolemy, from Copernicus, and from Columbus, and he determined that not only was the sun at the center of the universe, but that the sun was at the center of the galaxy, but that the galaxy wasn't even the center of the universe. And he got in some trouble for that. So the document that you have to read this week is a letter that Galileo wrote to a duchess. And I'm just going to set up what exactly it was that happened. These conversations are happening at dinners, at big events and big dinners. People are suddenly talking about all these things. It's humanism, new art, new music, new sciences, new philosophy, all those things. They're having those conversations over dinner at the nobles' mansions and stuff. So as people gather for big feasts, these are the conversations they're having around the table. And in 1613, so we've already, just to put things in perspective, Cortez has already been to Spain and been to Central America and back, like a long time ago, 1519 is when he went over there, I think. So in 1613, almost 100 years later, we're still having conversations about the nature of the way that the galaxy works, about what's actually revolving around what. 100 years later, people are still having this conversation. So a professor of philosophy stated that the earth could not be in motion because it says in the Bible that God stopped the sun in the sky. It says during a battle in the Old Testament with Joshua that God stopped the sun in the sky. And if that's the case, then it's not the earth that's not the sun that's in motion. It's the sun that's in motion, it's not the earth. If the sun can be stopped, that means that the earth must be still already, because it says so in the Bible, okay? This Duchess, who happens to be a granddaughter to one of those big Machiavellian families, the Medicis, tried to make this Benedictine monk who happened to be sitting there at the dinner explain this incongruity in the Bible. You're saying that all this sun and moon stuff is the way that your master Galileo says it is, but the Bible says this. Explain it to me. And he did his best, but he didn't do a very good job because he was kind of caught and cornered. I don't know, often people corner me and catch me out with things like that too, because in my other profession, I'm also a pastor. So I have these conversations. Well, explain to me right now in this moment without looking at any of your other books how this works in the Bible. And I'm like, can I please get back to you? So he was caught at dinner and all of the attention was focused on him. And he kind of didn't do a very good job. So he wrote to his old master, his former teacher Galileo, and said, can you cover this? Because I think I screwed it up. And the letter that you have to read is actually the letter that he wrote. Okay, so one of the things that Galileo says is that the Bible is a collection of stories and all the details are not exactly accurate. There's a reason Galileo was always in trouble with the church. So I want you to read this. This is what he's talking about. This is the argument right here. The reason produced for condemning the opinion that the earth moves and the sun stands still. In many places in the Bible, one may read that the sun moves and the earth stands still. Since the Bible cannot err, it follows as a necessary consequence that anyone takes an erroneous and heretical position who maintains that the sun is inherently motionless and the earth is movable. And we got to remember that lots of advances have been made in astronomy since then. Is the sun actually motionless? Anybody?
It's not.
It's not. It's actually spinning through space like crazily fast with like all of the planets hanging on to its orbit as fast as they can, because the universe is expanding, but there was no way for Galileo to know that. In the first place, it is very pious to say and prudent to affirm that the Holy Bible can never speak untruth whenever its true meaning is understood. Whenever its true meaning is understood. But I believe nobody will deny that it is often very abstruse. Y'all know what that word means? Abstruse?
Can be taken out of context?
Yeah, it can be taken out of context. There are places where it's not 100% clear, and that it can be the unadorned grammatical meaning. One might fall into error. There are contradictions and propositions. Anyway, I want you to read this letter because it covers an awful lot of ground between the new sciences and the old church in Europe. Because in order to make his argument, he has to continuously say, you're right, the Bible can't be wrong, but we could have been wrong when we read it. And then he begins to say that it's a holy thing, that God gave us senses and reason and intellect and all of those things and expected us to use them. So it's a very valuable letter, I think. The Duchess responded to him by basically saying, I don't even remember having this conversation with you, dude. So it's not really, her response is not, I don't necessarily need you to research that any further. But in Galileo's time, he supported this idea, and he studied the movement of cosmic motions and cosmic gravity, and the church literally kicked it back because of a passage in Joshua 10, chapter 10, verses 12 to 13, where the sun is held still. And he happens to be doing what he's doing in the middle of what's called the Roman Inquisition, which is when suddenly Rome began to send out people to end heresies that are happening in the church. So he comes out with his heliocentric universe at the same time that Rome is trying to put down heresies, because they're trying to make the entire European church fit under one canon. Y'all are familiar with canons, right?
Yeah.
When we refer to something being canon, we refer to this is a real thing that's happening in our fan fiction or whatever it is, in our fandom or in our game or whatever it is.
No, the Christian fandom.
And everything outside of it is not canon. And so they actually began to establish a canon episcopacy, canon episcopi, which was a universal way for the church to believe, and then to enforce it by sending out inquisitors, making sure that people, and they needed to, because there were people with some crazy ideas this time. There were the Cathars and the Waldensians, and the Cathars believed, for example, that there are two gods. There's the Old Testament God and the New Testament God, and they're different gods. And if you're a follower of the Old Testament God, then you like food. And if you're a follower of the New Testament God, then you don't. And like, they were very extreme about it. Anything that fed your body, anything that was materialistic or anything of this world was worship of the Old Testament God. And the worship of the New Testament God meant getting rid of all of that, fasting to the point of asceticism, to wasting away to nothing. Those were movements that were happening in churches that called themselves, part of the Christian church. So they had heresies that were pretty out there. But they also just had little disagreements that weren't really that far out there that they were also pursuing. This is also an age of witch hunts and witch trials and stuff like that.
At least we know they were kind about it. They kept having barbecues with people.
Speaking of which, one of the people that was persecuted this time was Giordano Bruno. He supported Copernicus's theory and postulated the theory of cosmic pluralism. He was the one who started talking about that maybe we're not even the only galaxy out there. Maybe we're just one galaxy in a very small, and he was burned at the stake, right? So this is what you will be studying on Thursday. We're not done with class, but I'm skipping a chunk right now. You'll be studying on Thursday the history of the Reformation. And the history of the Reformation begins with protesting movements against this Catholic Church. And remember, what do we mean when we say Catholic? Universal and crossing boundaries, okay? With a lowercase c, Catholic, that's what that means. It's a Greek word that means crossing boundaries. With an uppercase c, it means the church that has its leadership in Rome and exists today. But it's kind of like, if I say it's a Disciples of Christ church and it's lowercase d, then it's a church that considers itself having a bunch of disciples in it. But if it's a Disciples of Christ church, that's actually a denomination with its own books, right? So with its own, guidelines. So the Catholic Church at this time has a bunch of protesting movements that are spinning out as a result of this distrust in the church, the influx of new ideas, all of those things that came out of the Crusades. Suddenly there are people that are, and the translations of the Bible, which is by far the biggest reason that people are questioning the church, is because people who are not clergy can read the Bible. They can read because it's written in Latin, they can read it. So lawyers can read it, and we know what happens when lawyers get something to read. So you're going to study these protesting movements and their effect on the church, because two things happen. First of all, new denominations appear. Protestant denominations, Lutheranism, Calvinism, Presbyterianism, and Anglicanism are the biggest ones. But the second thing is the Catholic Church does actually make reforms, because it has definitely gotten to the point where it is a big kind of corrupt institution at this time. And the documentary will show you some of that. I love the fact that within the first 3 minutes of the documentary, you're already talking about the Pope's orgies. Anyway, so you can watch that on Thursday. So all of this is about that, the rise of different protesting movements. But because the turmoil that results takes decades decades of bloodshed as a result of these protesting movements, eventually all of Europe sort of coalesces into this middle way. And in some places it's better than others. Queen Elizabeth introduced what was called the middle way after her father left the the Catholic Church so that he could be the head of his own church, so he could divorce one lady and marry another. I mean, that's the only reason he did it. In all other ways, his church was identical to the Catholic Church, except that now the King of England was in charge of it. When these protesting movements make it into England, they tear the country apart. They tear it to pieces. And Elizabeth introduces what's called the middle way, which is we all swear loyalty to the same church, but how you practice that is up to you, and I'm not going to persecute you anymore. The same kind of thing begins to filter down into Germany, where people begin to respect each other's beliefs. But the closer to Rome you get, the more harsh those tolerances are, and the more they're looking for differences. So down into the Spanish Peninsula, for example, Protestant movements are stamped down really hard, and anybody who is not Catholic is punished pretty substantially. And that includes the scientists and the artists. So all of this is stuff that you will see in that documentary on Thursday, the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War. But as a result of those things, there's more access to information in Italy, but it's very new information, new sciences, new ideas are tightly controlled on the Iberian Peninsula. So even though they're the ones that are making all kinds of discoveries, exploring the Americas, what they bring back, they keep under very tight control. In France and Germany and even in England, those sciences are allowed to grow. Those sciences are allowed to spread. And so what you end up with is a shift from Spain being the center of all advancement and wealth and economic control, where, and the Medicis and the Borgias and all those families, to England being the center of all of those things, to Northern Germany being the center of all of those things, to Northern Europe becoming the place where new exciting things can happen. And you'll see that when we start with colonies, with the Industrial Revolution, that they all take their root in these places that have a higher tolerance for new ideas. Descartes was absolutely incensed about the way Galileo was treated. He absolutely hated the way Bruno was treated. He begins a movement of philosophy that wants to separate the spirit from the body. He believes in dualism, which means that there is investment that you have to do in your body so you can keep your body moving, and there is investment that you have to do in your spirit so you can be fit for heaven, and those two things are different. You have two completely different pursuits there. You have your spiritual life, and you have your human life. And it's important that you keep a distance between those things, because it's the fact that we let them bleed into each other that made us burn Bruno at the stake. And people begin to grasp onto, oh yeah, that sounds logical. I like that. Let's do that.
And stop burning people.
So what happens in the modern world when people separate their spiritual life from their practical day-to-day life? Yeah, I mean, well, we do that now, don't we? Yeah, you introduce ideas such as the separation of church and state. You have the, what do you call it, the frozen chosen in your pews on Sunday morning? The people who showed up on Sunday and checkmarked, I was here, and then go back to their daily life of drinking on Saturday night. You have this idea of dualism as something that happens that makes it possible to introduce all of these new governmental ideas too. So this wave of new information from the Crusades, it has a bigger, more profound effect than we even realize. As a matter of fact, it is literally still having an effect. These old ideas being reinvented and then reinvested in the Renaissance, it ripples, and those ripples still come through every once in a while. So like we are right now, I believe, and I'm just, looking at this is not historical me, this is philosophical me. We are right now in a resurgence of this, one of these ripples, because suddenly Gen Z is finding out all this stuff from the ancient past and bringing it forward and being like, what about this thing that y'all have completely forgotten about? And as a result, we have people doing, for example, yoga spiritually, doing it because it brings your spirit a place of calm so that you can have a workplace that's more calm, so that it's, all of these ancient ideas that are actually filtering into the new generation as though they're new ideas. So we're actually witnessing it happen right now. I'm very curious where it's going to go from here. I'm a Gen Xer. I've mentioned this probably. I'm part of this teeny little generation of people. It's just They're the best, but the reason for that is because we are like dedicated survivors, and that's pretty much all we are. We have boomers on one side and millennials on the other. We're just like, we're just watching, okay? We're here for you, but we're just watching.
So did he actually oppose separation of church and state?
No, but it's based partly on his ideology. The first idea of separating church and state literally happens in North America in 1776. Yeah, I mean, they are the first government to actually try that, to even propose that it might be okay to do it. Right, so in the midst of this rippling effect, we have Isaac Newton, who begins to, now Isaac Newton, I encourage you to look up Isaac Newton and research him a little bit, because that man was crazy. Oh my gosh, he was crazy. But he did, and he wasn't the only person having these ideas. He just published them faster than anybody else. He's not quite Thomas Edison with the whole idea theft thing, but he did not work well. He's more like Sheldon Cooper. He actually was brilliant. He was just crazy.
He was super full of himself.
He was very, very narcissistic and very arrogant, but he did actually pursue a lot of ideas. And as a result of his ideas, we have this rippling effect of scientific revolution that comes over the land. He begins to question the laws of physics and gravity and begins to document them in such a way that basically creates the scientific method. Now, he didn't invent it, the scientific method. Yes?
Did he die a virgin?
I don't know. I wasn't there. How old do you think I am? Anyway.
I mean, that's what the documentary said. It said he invented calculus and died a virgin. So, I mean, I guess we got our
It's
revenge
entirely
on him.
possible, and I absolutely respect his right to be asexual.
Hey, you're one up on him. You're still alive.
Oh, I thought you were going to say because you're not a virgin. Y'all are missing out. I just want to say, people on Zoom, you don't know. Okay.
All right.
But because he introduces the idea that you can apply laws that stay the same, because you can identify them through experimentation, and then you can find out what they are, and then you can document them. The universe obeys these laws. Suddenly there's a rush of people trying to understand what the laws are. So there's a rush of people who begin to experiment, because the possibility is, if everything can be understood, if science has its free reign, then we can understand everything. Now, he turns out to be wrong about that, because the laws themselves are wibbly wobbly. Yeah, even the laws themselves that he uncovers don't apply all the time, as Einstein finds out later. But there's a rush of people who suddenly are very interested in uncovering and documenting the laws of creation and how the world works. So on the other side of his new sciences, you have people applying that to social science, trying to understand how societies work, trying to understand how human anatomy works, trying to understand how all of these different areas of science work. How are we doing on time?
908.
Okay, so we're closing in on it now. Do we want to get into this? Yeah, we do. Okay, so we are applying these things to natural sciences, to the science of growth, to herbology, to all kinds of things. But then people are like, if we can understand how the universe works, then we can understand how people work. And you have the introduction of the social sciences. The social sciences are pushed by people who want to understand how societies are formed. And at the bottom of this social science is people like Thomas Hobbes, who invents what's called social contract theory. The social contract? I think so. Was that Hobbes? I don't know, somebody look that up. I think it is, though. And then John Locke, who proposed the theory of natural rights, which is that everybody is born with an inherent right to, anybody? The pursuit of, and there it is. Okay. That everybody is born with these natural rights, and they include life, liberty, and the pursuit of property.
Yes, Thomas Hobbes did the social contract.
I thought so, but thank you.
I got here. Mine says Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Say what?
Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Oh yeah, Rousseau wrote the social contract. Okay, well, and that actually comes, that's, okay, we're gonna get into that when we talk about the Enlightenment. All of this is gonna get pulled apart. We're gonna talk about the man made of men and all of that kind of stuff when we talk about the Enlightenment. So as a result of all of this, we have other people who are introducing themselves into the idea of sciences, and one of them is Bishop James Ussher. I have strong opinions about Bishop James Ussher, and I will try really hard to sit on them as I say this next part, but he used maths and the language in the Bible to pinpoint exactly when creation happened. October 22nd at 6 p.m., 4004 BC.
That makes sense.
Right, so the world is now 6,024 years old, according to Bishop James Ussher. He used the math that of the documentation of the Old Testament and calculated backwards and said, well, if all of this math is correct, then this is when the world was created. And there were people that believed him, okay? Like a lot of people, they were like, sure, sounds good to us, because they didn't really have a whole lot of documented history before that, and the science of archaeology was just barely getting on its feet. He did this, and then immediately, or within the next 100 years, somebody in Scotland using a stone in a wall proved that the world must be older than that, because the stone in this wall is older than that. And then there was a flashback or a back and forth between the church and these new scientists saying, well, maybe God created it already old. Maybe when God created the world, he created it old. He created old pieces in
And
it.
they put fossils in the ground to turn us to Satan instead.
And we are still having this debate today. Yeah, of course. Part of the faith, you know, it's an exercise of faith to accept that the world is only as old as the Bible says it is, despite science telling you another thing. I have strong opinions about this, but they are not related to history. All I will say is that all historical evidence points to the world being much older than that. So, and we do now have documentation from societies that are much older than that. So we do know that even if the stones started off old, we have documented human life 10,000 years ago. So
God made that.
I know, I'm sorry.
But what if the devil made it?
Anyway, in the midst of this back and forth between new sciences and new ideologies and old church alliances, we have a rise of leaders who try to get everybody back under the same umbrella and back to the same ideas. So we have a rise of absolutist leaders who begin to disenfranchise anybody who thinks differently from them. And that's where we're going to pick up a couple of weeks from now. We're going to talk about the absolutist leaders after I get back from my trip on Thursday. So I want you to study the Reformation. Let me see. So there's supposed to be an assignment attached to this. Okay, there's supposed to be a question that I have for you to answer on this, and for some reason it's not appearing here. I will put it up before the end of the day, a question that you can answer based on you don't want to miss out on those 5 possible points. You want homework. The more homework you have, the better off you are. Huh?
The more padding you.
Yes, the worse you can do on a test. The more homework you have, the worse you can do on the test. So I will go ahead, I'll put that assignment up there. I don't know why it's not up there, but I'll put it up before the end of the day. Sometime before Sunday, watch this documentary and do this assignment as well. So you have 2 1-paragraph questions. Now, these paragraphs, they're not papers. They don't require like a whole lot of, go ahead and blah if you really want to, if you have a lot to say about something. But it's 100 to 300 words. It's a paragraph or 2 at most. So go ahead and, be kind to yourself. Don't stress about it. But you'll have a paragraph to answer a question on the Galileo letter, and then you'll have a question to answer on the documentary. And I will see you next Tuesday. Anybody have any questions? Anybody on Zoom? Any questions I can answer for y'all? Y'all doing okay? All right. Anybody have any questions about class on Thursday? Y'all got that there isn't one of those, right? Give me a thumbs up or something. Okay, we lost Sam like a really long time ago, Sam Whiting. That's not good. Okay, all right, I'll see you guys on Tuesday.